to see the difference between the bias, which is the average error, and the noise, which is the random variability in the judgments. Suppose that we're making a forecast of, say, what the GDP growth is going to be next year or something like that. If on average, all of us who are making this forecast tend to be optimistic, that's a bias. We overestimate, that's an average error. But each of us is going to make a slightly different forecast. The variability between our forecasts is noise. So it's really quite simple. Bias is a predictable error in a given direction. It's the average error of a number of people or a number of observations by the same person. Noise is the variability in those observations.
Well, this hour we are talking with Olivier Sibony and Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, about their new book, Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment, and how that flaw in human judgment is amplified across organizations and systems that can touch us all. We'll be right back. This is On Point.
Not all survive to adulthood, as is common in that time and place, but she was in the middle of a big family.
Betsy was born Elizabeth Griscom, and at the age of 21, she rebelled against her strict Quaker upbringing. She ran away and married John Ross, who was not a Quaker, and this led her family to basically disown her. So she and John fled to the big city, Philadelphia. They opened up an upholstery shop, and things were really good for a couple of years, until John died in an explosion during the Revolutionary War.
So there she is. It's January of '76, and she's a young widow. And at that time, in the course of the Revolution, Philadelphia is fearful that the British Navy is going to appear. And so there is a mad scramble to create what's essentially the first Navy.
And what does the Navy need? You know, besides ships. That's right, flags. Anyone who could push a needle through a piece of fabric was competing for government contracts to sew these flags. Didn't matter if you were a dressmaker, a saddler, or a upholsterer. The government was desperate for flags. And Ross no longer had her family or a husband to help support her. She was desperate too.
And I think that Betsy Ross saw that happening and wanted to get on the Rolodex for those contracts. And so I always say, like, it's Betsy Ross, government contractor, is what we need to be thinking.
Betsy Ross, government contractor, wasn't sitting at home quietly sewing on her lawn. She was out kicking butts and taking names. She sniffed tobacco, ran a commercial upholstery shop, and wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty.
It's pretty physical labor.
This is On Point. I'm Meghna Chakrabarty, and today we're talking with Daniel Kahneman. He's the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, perhaps the world's most influential psychologist. He's the author of the book Thinking Fast and Slow, and we're talking as well with Professor Olivier Sibony. They, along with Cass Sunstein, have co-authored a new book called Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment, about how that flaw, human judgment's flaw, gets amplified through systems, creates noise, and makes it harder to come to the right decisions and what to do as well. So I'd like to focus with the two of you on one particular system that you write at length about, and that is the judicial system. So, Professor Sibony, I'm wondering if you can help us understand what is the evidence that there is a great deal of noise, or this unwanted variability, as you both call it, in judgments in the judicial system?
So there has been evidence for quite a while. One of the studies that we cite in the book goes back to the 1970s, and in that study, a great many judges, 208 judges to be precise, looked at vignettes describing cases. So very simplified descriptions of cases where you would expect pretty good agreement on how to sentence a particular defendant, because the judges aren't distracted by the particulars of what happens in the courtroom, or by the looks of the defendant, or by any distracting information. You would expect some consistency, perhaps not perfect consistency, but at least some consistency. And it turns out that on some of those cases, one judge would say 15 days and another one would say 15 years. On average, for a 7-year prison term, that was the average given by the 200 judges, there was, if you were to pick two different judges, a difference of almost 4 years in what the sentence would be. Which basically tells you that if you're a defendant, the moment you walk into the courtroom because you've been assigned to a particular judge, that has already added 2 years or subtracted 2 years from what would be otherwise a 7-year sentence. That is truly shocking. You would want, of course, the specifics of the case and the specifics of the defendant and all the particular circumstances of a particular offense to be taken into account. But the particular circumstances of the judge should not make a big difference to the sentence, and they do. And there have been quite a few other studies replicating and amplifying this finding, which basically tell you that who the judge happens to be has a very, very large influence on the sentence. Of course, we know that, but it's much larger than we suspect it is.
Right. I mean, the legal profession has known this for quite some time. To your point, that they would, lawyers always talk about hoping to get assigned particular judges for their clients. But just to be clear, so these judges in the studies that you're talking about were given sort of stripped down information about cases, so that ostensibly the factors that would normally contribute to bias from the individual judge were removed, and yet we still saw this variability in sentencing. Is that what you're saying?
That is right. You can only expect that in reality the noise would be much worse than what we measure here, because these are stripped down cases where all the distracting information that could add and amplify the biases of the judge has been taken out.
Okay. So Daniel Kahneman, do we know why there was so much variability, even in these controlled circumstances, amongst these judges who, I mean, their profession is called judges. We are told we're supposed to trust their judgment.
Well, actually, there is more than one source of noise. We distinguish three. So one source of noise are differences in the severity, and that's, hanging judges and others. And that's the mean sentence, the mean of a lot of sentences that the judge gives differ across judges. We call that level noise. Then there is the noise within a judge, that is elements that are like the weather. It turns out that sentences are more severe on hot days. It turns out that judges are more lenient when their football team just won a game. Those are small effects, but they are reliable effects. So it turns out that there is a lot of noise within the judge, just as we were talking earlier about radiologists. And probably the